Today, the ancient Egyptian civilization by Veerabhadraya Demaya, marine geoanalytical chemist retired from the Geological Survey of India, staying in Bangalore, Kalyananagar. Well, early dynastic period of Egypt. The early dynastic period was approximately contemporary to the early Sumerian Akkadian Empire civilization of Mesopotamia and of ancient Elam. Here, the very important thing to know, this is Egypt, famous for their monuments, the pyramids and the sphinx. Let us discuss in detail in the forthcoming slides, my dear friends. Ancient Egyptian civilization is a very important concept of discussion today. Ancient Egyptian civilization tells about the Menethos history of Egypt, which are having a dynasties is equivalent to 31. 31 dynasties are there, which are classified into the four main groups of the ancient Egyptian civilization. Early dynasty, Old Kingdom, the next Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom, the third intermediate. If you observe the chronological calendar, early dynastic period, Old Kingdom, first intermediate period, Middle Kingdom, second intermediate period, New Kingdom, and the third intermediate. So these are the very important things to know. If you observe the chronological data, Golden Age, the yellow indicates the Golden Age, and the intermediate period, blue line, and the early and the late periods is red bars. Early dynastic period of Egypt and monuments. If you observe the slide carefully, the first one is mastaba tombs, which are considered and which are read as eternal homes of Egypt, and mortuary cult structures of Abydos. So these are the mastaba tombs in the Egypt civilization we come across. Wonderful monuments, and these are the wonderful monuments today we can see in the Egypt, and these are the graphic structure where the mastaba tombs, how they are architect and all. Next, the Great Sphinx of Giza. This was the wonderful World Heritage Center as well as the Egyptian monument, the seven wonders of the world, pyramids and the sphinx, very important. The great obelisk pillars of Egypt, ancient civilization is concerned. Nile River in Egypt is a very important. This Nile River has got its own importance in the history of Egypt. One and only the unique river, which is the longest river in the world on the planet Earth. It flows from south to north and reaches finally to the Mediterranean Sea, my dear friends. If you observe carefully, the Nile River is starting Lake Nasser, Aswan, Luxor, and it flows up to the longest traveling of river, and it reaches Giza via Cairo, and in Alexandria, Demeter, Port Said, and all these things are this is the end of the flow of River Nile and reaches the Mediterranean Sea. Well, early dynastic period of Egypt is concerned. It's considered the lowest Egypt and the Upper Egypt. Lower Egypt is reaching Mediterranean sea, which is a coastal plain, and the upper Egypt is in the middle of the Egypt. The 3rd century BC Egyptian priest Menetho grouped the long line of pharaohs from Menes to his own time into 30 dynasties, the system still used today. He began his official history with a king named Mene, or Menes in the Greek, who was believed to have united the two kingdoms, Upper Egypt and the Lower Egypt. It is nothing but the unification of Egypt on those days by Pharaoh Menes, who is the important person who controlled over both Lower Egypt and as well as the Upper Egypt in his regime. Early dynastic period of Egypt, a unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. As I told you, the transition to a unified state happened more gradually than ancient Egyptian writers represented, and there is no contemporary record of Menes. Some scholars now believe, however, that the mythical Menes may have been the king Narmer, who is depicted wearing royal regalia on the ceremonial Narmer Palette in a symbolic act of unification of Egypt, the upper and the lower Nile River of Egypt. King Narmer was the first pharaoh in the history of Egypt who ruled and unified Upper Nile region and the Lower Nile region of ancient Egypt. Well, the valleys of the kings and queens was created to prevent grave robbers from robbing the pharaoh's tombs. On those days, grave robbers were there. They are crazy and greedy towards the valuable things, the gold ornaments and other things from the pharaohs after the death. So they wanted to rob the tombs. This symmetry was used in the period around 1500 to 1000 BC. Out of 31 dynasties ruled in the Egypt, the history of Egypt, 18th to 20th dynasties were used, and many pharaohs were buried in these cemeteries. Many pharaohs, the kings, after their deaths, they are buried in the cemeteries. The increasing power and wealth of the kings during the early dynastic period was reflected in their elaborate mastaba tombs and mortuary cult structures at Abydos, which were used to celebrate the defeat king after his death. So this is the important monuments, the cemeteries, that is the early dynastic period of Egypt concerned, and the wonderful monuments of Egypt, of the ancient history of Egypt. Now this is the cemetery, and this is the cemetery which is where the kings are the pharaohs, kings of Egypt after their death, they will bury it. And this is the view of this structure at Abydos, Giza, Cairo, the Nile River, where it reaches the Mediterranean Sea, the valleys of the kings and queens. This is the Lake Nasser, and this is a very important fact of the Egypt history. Well, friends, continuing the early dynastic period of Egypt, in the history of dynastic period which began about 3000 BC. The first of the dynastic pharaohs solidified control over Lower Egypt by establishing a capital at Memphis, from which could control the labor force and agriculture of the fertile delta region, as well as the lucrative and critical trade routes to the Levant, where the Red Sea region and Mediterranean coastal region of Egypt. The increasing power and wealth of the kings during the early dynastic period was reflected in the elaborate mastaba homes, mortuary cult structures at Abydos, which were used to celebrate the defeated king after his death. The strong institution of kingship developed by the king served to legitimate state and control over the land, labor, and resources that were essential to the survival and the growth of ancient Egypt civilization. Well, friends, this is the beautiful Nile River, which acts as a predominant role in the history of Egypt and the fertility and the mythical views of Egypt, the god and goddesses of Nile River. Ancient Egypt civilization, the Nile has been lifeline of its region for much of human history. The fertile floodplain of the Nile gave humans the opportunity to develop a settled agriculture economy and a more sophisticated centralized society that became a cornerstone in the history of human civilization. The Nile River has certainly played a critical role in the history of ancient Egypt, famous as the longest river in the world. The river got its name from the Greek word Nilos, which means valley. The Nile floods the lands in Egypt, leaving behind black sediment. That's why the ancient Egyptians named the river Air, meaning black. A land owned by the Egyptians and given them by the Nile Greek historian Herodotus, circa 5000 BC. Gods and goddesses, lord of the fish and birds of the marshes for physical elements. God of crocodile represents fertility of the Nile River. Sobek, god of the Nile, lord of the river bringing vegetation. It will give the fertility of the Nile River, which gives a very good vegetation on those days, my dear friends. Let us move to the ancient Egyptian civilization. Nomadic modern human hunter-gatherers began living in the Nile Valley through the end of the Middle Pleistocene, some 120,000 years ago. By the late Paleolithic period, the arid climate of northern Africa became increasingly hot and dry, forcing the populations of the area to concentrate along the river region Nile. Nile River was the best way to record the ancient Egyptian civilization in history. It's also the holy secret of success in other fields. Cultivation was the first activity that formed the pillars of Egyptian empire on those days in the history of Egypt, my dear friends.